The race is on, and McLaren joined the 2020 party by launching the new Renault-engined MCL35 in an event at the McLaren Technology Centre today. But has the team made a car that will allow Carlos Sainz Jr. and Lando Norris to continue their strong form? I'm your host, Edd Straw, and joining me today is special guest Lawrence Barretto from F1.com, and we'll also be hearing Gary Anderson's technical analysis of the new car. So Lawrence, here we are at the McLaren Technology Centre shortly after the launch. Great feeling of optimism here. Last year it was all about humility, but now it's all about excitement, isn't it? This is a team on the up.
It's so refreshing. I think you walk around this place, and we've been fortunate that we could spend a couple of hours here, and you get to meet a lot of the staff who work here, and they're happy, they're excited, they're confident, and that's not something you could say about McLaren employees for many years when the tough times during Honda. So I think there is a lot of optimism around here, and even today, the car launch, it was a proper car launch. There was a car, and I think that's a good thing, but they didn't go over the top. It was all about the car, no acrobatics. This is the car, and this is what we want to achieve and focus on this year. Yeah,
very much so. Very, very focused. I'm slightly surprised because you're a man famous for your dramatic trousers, and you've gone with kind of old school McLaren, sort of a silvery grey trouser colour. I'm just wondering, do you not have any papaya matte papaya? That's what colour the car is now.
That's probably one colour that's not in my current clothing palette, so maybe I need to change that. And I haven't got my yellow shoes on today, so that's probably disappointing to you too, Ed.
Yeah, you're not as on brand as hype. But yeah, it is interesting with McLaren because last year it was all about humility, wasn't it? They kept using that word after some terrible times. But today the messaging's very different. They're not ridiculously optimistic, but they are sort of cautiously, sensibly optimistic. Obviously, they're talking about the long-term aim to get back to the front. They know that's not going to happen this year, but there's been some areas of the car that have changed to try and unlock that potential. So it does seem also a team that not only has made progress, but it's also kind of got that assuredness back in that they know where they're going, they know what they're trying to achieve.
I think it's that feeling that they are portraying confidence, but they've got like a solid foundation to base that on. And I feel like last year they spent a lot of time building on the building blocks that they'd put in at the start of the year. Then as they went through the year, they got results and they got fortune, but it was fortune that was deserved. That podium in Brazil, yeah, fine. It wasn't based on pure performance, but it was something that was deserved for the fact that they had just been improving race on race all throughout the year. Looking at the car this year, it looks a little bit more aggressive, and it feels like they're taking another step forward. And Zak Brown talked today about turning a corner, and I think that's interesting because it's the first time, like you were saying earlier, that they feel like they've maybe got out of that initial holding pattern where they were just trying to find themselves again. It's just a real buzz around here, a real excitement, but based on pure data and feeling, I think, that they've been building on.
Well, we had a lengthy press conference after with Zak Brown and the rest of his leadership team, and he said that he feels kind of everything's in place. And of course, Andreas Seidel, the team principal, James Keith, the technical director, they weren't on board at this stage last year. They hadn't started work. But so again, that kind of solidity, all these strategic moves that the team's making. There's some questions to Lando Norris about the next generation simulator they're working on. We know they've got for down the line the new wind tunnel. So just that sure-footedness, which is really encouraging about McLaren. You did mention the car. And you can see, even though I think James Key called the MCL34 last year's car the father of the concept of the car, but tighter packaging at the rear, the side pods, etc., some geometry checks. So this is sort of the step in the right direction. A little bit of greater complexity in the car, which is exactly what you see from the top three teams.
And I think they've done that, or they've been able to do that because they built confidence from last year. I think they've been able to feel like this is a stepping stone from last year. If last year was terrible, they'd have to really start again from scratch, and they don't really want to do that, especially in a year when they're going to have to change things up for 2021 next year. You could see from the way that James and Andreas and Zak kind of interact, you can see that they've gelled well. I think it's important when you bring new people in, if they're independently good, they still need to work together well, and I feel like they do understand each other. They both had very quick impacts on the team. This is obviously James's first proper go at the car as well since he's joined McLaren, and there's lots of detailing, I think, on that car that is very James Key-esque, and I think that can only be a good thing going forward.
Obviously, the big challenge is whether they can actually get to the front, because it's a very, very long way. I mean, this year they've talked about, obviously they want to hold on to fourth place. It's not realistic to go for the top three. They didn't say anything suggesting that they could do that. So it's going to be, in terms of results, probably kind of more of the same this year. But they did say they were hoping they could get a little bit closer to the front. I think they're on average about 1.6% off in terms of pace last year. So sensible strategic moves, but also that feeling they're in it for the long haul, should we say?
I think so. And, if they aren't near the big three by the end of the year, like you said, they're not going to be disappointed if they feel like they've made steps in other areas. Andreas mentioned about the pit stops. That was one of their issues last year. So if they can nail that this year, that's something that's going to benefit them from 2021 onwards. I think it's just still building all of those steps that they need to do to be a stronger force going forward, because they know that they're not going to be up fighting for wins and championships in the short term. It's going to take 3, 4, 5 years, but that's what they've been working on, a long-term plan. And I feel like they just are making those steps gradually, and so far, so good.
Yeah, it's all about, there's no magic bullets, are there? No. So they have to just do everything really well, like we see from, say, Mercedes, which is the gold standard team. But also, obviously, the two drivers fit together very well. Carlos Sainz and Lando Norris, they talked about during the live stream launch component, they said that they'd had more input into the car, and they did talk a little bit more about that later. So again, that continuity, that youth as well that they both bring to it. Carlos Sainz, obviously, when he was sort of suggested he was the older hand, he did point out he was only 25.
I know, it's crazy, isn't it?
But he is the older hand. He's been around in Formula 1 for quite a few years now, and he drove quite superbly last year. So again, it's just nice and straightforward. They seem to cohere with the engineering team and vice versa. Like you say, everyone knows their place. Even though the three of the leadership team were being asked questions, they were very good at knowing, right, that's Zach Brown's department, that's Andreas Seidel's department, that's James Key's. So, small thing, but it's feeling like a well-oiled machine.
Definitely, and I think that can only bode well for the future, even if you don't see immediately the results on track. I think a lot of the work that McLaren still need to do is behind the scenes, and that's still getting those systems in place, still getting the teams working in harmony, and also maintaining the relationship between Carlos and Lando as well going forward, because at the moment they're getting on very well. But I think as the team gets stronger, as they're fighting for bigger and better results, that's going to be something that they're going to have to manage. Also, this is Lando's second year, so he's going to feel more settled. He was talking earlier about how he feels like last year he didn't often say what he wanted to do or a direction he wanted to go in, because he thought it might be the wrong one and he didn't want to lead the team down the wrong alley. This year I don't think there's going to be as much of that, and that might bring him closer to Carlos, and I think that's when it's going to get interesting.
Yeah, as soon as the stakes are higher and everyone wants to assert themselves in the team, hopefully it'll be at that level where they push each other on, because when you're not fighting for championships, you don't tend to get those tinderbox moments in quite the same way. No,
quite. And I think you're right. There were races last year where Lando would often out-qualify Carlos, but then on race day, Carlos, his stronger racecraft meant he was ahead of Lando kind of in those first turns on the first couple of laps anyway. So I think it will be interesting to see how that relationship develops. But as of today, you could see they were still kind of joking around with each other today. They still get on very well. And that's a really good thing for the team to have. They've got two drivers who are keen, they're young, they want to be involved. A lot of F1 drivers don't like coming into the factory, and these guys have both moved closer so that they can come into the factory more often. And I feel like it's little things like that make a real difference.
Lando Norris did say he timed it at 3 minutes 20 seconds into the factory since he's moved, and he did stress that was within the speed limit. Well, we'll briefly hear from Gary Anderson about this car after this break, and then we'll be back with Lawrence Barretto in a minute for a little bit more McLaren chat.
Will your summer sound like this?
Train is delayed.
Or this?
Evening, everybody.
This?
Assistant required.
Or this? This? Or this?
Make it a summer of Amex and do more with American Express experiences. With exclusive pre-sale tickets for Somerset House Summer Series, Wimbledon and British Summertime in Hyde Park. Search Why Amex. Subject to availability, terms apply.
Well, I'm very pleased to welcome now Gary Anderson to give his technical analysis of the McLaren MCL35. McLaren, of course, is another one of your former teams, albeit back in the days of James Hunt. It's a team that is on an upward trend, but I have to say, you've been a little bit disappointed with the car in some ways, haven't you?
I worked for McLaren back in the late 70s. I spent sort of 3.5, 4 years there as a mechanic and as chief mechanic. And, it's a team, actually, it's very close to my heart, and probably that's why I've said that I just don't really see enough in the car, as far as I'm concerned. It's one of those things where I think they've had a very, very good year in 2019 on a good upward slope from really having a pretty bad season since they joined Honda. And even before that, they sort of seemed to lose their way a little bit. But the team has restructured itself. It's taken a step forward. Andreas Seidel and James Key joining will give them a bit more depth. And I think the future is bright. But I think as far as the car is concerned at the moment, I'd like to have seen more on it. Bit of testing to go. And it's 4 weeks to the first race. So I'm sure there'll be changes on the car. But, my initial impression is I would like to have seen a little bit more on it.
We can see that the front wing has changed a little, with McLaren inching slightly more towards what we call the loaded outboard concept. What does that tell us?
The front wing, it's again the compromise between loading the inboard part and loading the outboard part, or creating outwash around the front tyres with the outboard part. I think what they've got is a decent compromise. And as I always said, there's a compromise between the two. Last year we saw Ferrari with a very, very drippy outboard end in the front wing. We saw Mercedes and Red Bull with, much more loaded outboard end. So I think there's a compromise in there. And I think as the season progresses, we'll see that compromise sort of come to fruition. It's just one of those things where you can't create the downforce if you don't have the downforce producing devices, but still you want the stability or the consistency of that outwash that helps the car, basically helps the rest of the car function. So again, it's an area, it's a bolt-on component. I'm sure we'll see some differences in that as the season progresses.
James Key talked about some changes of geometry at the front, which will be all about the crucial front ride height control. This is an area where any midfield team needs to make big gains to close in on the front, isn't it?
James Key, the new technical director, has talked about some changes of the geometry, front geometry and rear geometry. Now, the front geometry is something there that everybody's exploiting, is the change of ride height with steering lock to try to get the car to have more front grip in low-speed corners, and or lose a little bit of front grip in high-speed corners. No driver likes oversteer in the fast corners, but all these cars understeer a lot in the slow corners. So it's a bit of a challenge to get that, and also not to sort of affect the steering weight. The driver feels the car with the load in the steering wheel and the forces in his body. So the feeling of the steering is very, very critical to how the driver can exploit the maximum out of the car. And that these changes can make a big difference. These changes in the front suspension can make a big difference in that area. The rear end of the car and the gearbox rear suspension layout is all about minimising the blockage. Nearly all the teams that we've seen so far have had a big go at tidying up the rear end and making it a lot narrower, a lot neater and tidier. That means moving probably the inboard parts of the rear suspension forward a bit, so there's not as much blockage there. It allows the Coke bottle to be more aggressive. And the back of the car really does make the front of the car work. So, you've got to get that air, that exhaust air behind the car. You've got this big low pressure area with these big rear tyres, the diffuser, to sort of pull on the car and bring the airflow through the car. And opening that up, getting more airflow through there, which means closing down on the internal components, makes a big difference to the whole car really. So it's an area where everybody has pushed pretty hard on it.
The barge boards on the launch car aren't anything dramatic. Would you expect that to change a lot as testing progresses?
The barge boards need to be, a lot more bits and pieces on them. If you look at the Mercedes barge boards from the end of last season, I mean, they were amazing. How somebody could create that. Now, you'd have to assume by their performance that all of that was working. I haven't seen all that stuff on the McLaren yet. The huge amount of detail, little turning vanes, vertical, horizontal, twisted, whatever. But all of those sort of set up that turning moment and pull more airflow through the front of the chassis, and means the airflow across the leading edge of the side pod is travelling faster, which in turn gives you more downforce. So again, it's a bolt-on component, so I'm sure we'll see developments as time goes by.
We've mentioned before on this podcast that McLaren already had new concepts planned, and James Key specifically pointed to the area rearwards of the cockpit as key, so that's the side pods, the gearbox is more tightly packaged, the whole rear end. How impressed are you with that?
McLaren, they sort of planned quite a lot of new concepts, I suppose, but that really is, nothing is a new concept. It's all about exploiting what you've got. You just really have to. The rules don't allow it really now. The rules are the same as last year, and even then the rules don't allow for, any lateral thinking like the Brabham fan car or the Lotus ground effect car. You have to exploit and detail everything that you've got and to the maximum, and that's all you can do. I think McLaren have focused around the rear of the car to try to to make it work a lot better. So it's a matter of squeezing everything and finding new solutions to stuff. So they've done that pretty well. I think it's tightly packaged. You just need to make sure you get the cooling because, these cars need to have a lot of cooling because of the PU, all the power unit, all the bits and pieces that go with that. They definitely need the temperature looking after.
So what's your overall verdict, Gary? Is this the car to take McLaren on the next step towards the front? We've still got cars to see, but do you think it's got a good chance of holding on to fourth and inching towards the big three?
It's a very difficult thing to put an overall verdict on the car. And I think I don't see McLaren really getting in amongst the top three. I could see them closing the gap up to the top three a little bit. But I could also see them losing out in position because the reality of it is the Haas last year was actually a quick car. They tripped up on the races a lot. And they probably shouldn't do that again this year. They should have learned their lesson. The Force India, as it's now Racing Point, definitely lost their way a little bit. All the changes of ownership and whatever meant that they didn't get the best out of themselves last year. But they'll have learned that, and this year they should be a strong team. We haven't seen their car yet, but they are a strong team. They're a strong race team, so they could be in there as competition. Renault have got a lot to prove. They haven't really done what they should do, and they have to do it this year. So they need to be pushing hard. So I don't think it's a case of McLaren doing well and moving away from that midfield bunch. I think it's McLaren's finishing position in the championship will be a lot more down to how good these other teams do it. Do I see enough in the car to close the gap to the big teams? At this point in time, no. But it's 4 weeks to go to the first race. They need to make changes before then if they're going to really give Red Bull or Ferrari or Mercedes a bit of a talking to. So we'll see. Time will tell.
Well, always fascinating to hear from Gary, and plenty for him to get his teeth into on this car. I mean, you did say this whole event you were mentioning earlier, just sort of how sort of well run everything was, which again reflects the way McLaren sort of got itself together now, because we didn't have any random singing or dancing.
No.
It's kind of right. There's your launch. There's the car. Lengthy, proper interviews with the key personnel and the drivers, where you could actually get proper answers on the car. And again, I keep sort of coming back to this. It's this sort of sure-footedness and assuredness. They know exactly where they are. They don't think they're a brilliant team that should be winning and they're being held back by an engine as maybe they did a few years ago. But and I just think this is so important because, as Renault have been saying, it takes such a long time to get to the front in Formula One. You've got to be on the right direction, because if you go in the wrong direction, you're adding years to that process. And I feel they've got their eyes on the very long-term goal in that regard.
Definitely, I think you're right. Today was ruthlessly efficient, and it was very McLaren. I think they got the car out. They showed that's what everyone wanted to see. They didn't spend too much time having a chat on stage, but then, as you said, they made the key personnel available so that they could explain the McLaren story. And ultimately, that's all we want. We want to hear from the guys who have been involved with the car across the winter, and to get the detail out to the fans out there. So I feel like today we learned a lot about the McLaren project. We learned a lot about the challenges that they faced over the winter, and we learned a lot about the targets that they've set themselves this year. And everything sounds very optimistic, but it's very realistic, and I think that just shows a team in a very good place.
But let's just talk about the targets for the team. James Key was asked about this, and he said, well, obviously the target is to get to the front. And it is strange, isn't it? Because when you're in this midfield group, you are fundamentally limited, and there's this vast chasm. And so you have to unlock these areas of the cars. James Key did mention that there's a few areas that a lot of the midfield teams have in common, because they just don't have that level of detail, and it's just such a long haul. So they're in a weird position this year, because they could finish fourth at exactly the same level as last year and they'll be a bit disappointed, even if they have a good points advantage, or they could finish fourth at a much higher level and the results on paper will be 99% the same, but there's kind of a difference between an outstanding and a very good, and even an average year, and pretty much they all add up to McLaren being fourth. Obviously anything further back they can't afford to do, but
No.
it's a bit weird for a racing team to have that mindset. Effectively last year they did the best they could possibly do, but they were still only fighting for 7th and 8th without others hitting problems.
I think they are probably facing a year where there's not going to be a lot of fanfare about what they do, and I don't think that's a bad thing, because it kind of means that they can just knuckle down and focus on what they're trying to do in the long term. I think you've got someone like Carlos who's actually facing the prospect of having a worse result in the Drivers' Championship last year because he outperformed outperformed the car, and also there was the change between Gasly and Albon.
Yeah, that was brilliant because it kind of opened the door for a possible sixth place. He did very, very well to nab it, particularly seeing he's had a lot of problems during. But I mean, both drivers lost quite a few points. Lando Norris, in fairness, probably had more problems just through the luck. But yeah, impressive from Sainz.
Yeah, and yeah, you're right. Lando had the worst run of luck, at McLaren last year. So he'll be hoping that things turn around for him this year. But, if Carlos finishes 7th, I still think that's the strongest result that he can get on paper, I guess, at this stage. That's still a really strong season for him. And I feel like if he can continue to do that, and that's what his main aim will be, it sets him up beautifully for 2021 and onwards.
So finally, everyone's been asking, when's McLaren going to be back? I mean, I think my feeling is where they are at the moment, they're on the way back, which is as good as it can be. They're not back where they want to be yet. This is a team that historically, and it makes much of its history. In fact, we saw, obviously, they showed some of their historic cars in their launch video as well. But just on that long haul back to the front, and reason for optimism. So this is all very positive, very different to what we were saying about McLaren 12 months, 18 months ago. It's a place that just does actually feel like it could be more than just another Grand Prix team now. It's
going to be a long road back to where they used to be. And, I was just in the Boulevard here, and they've got all of the cars, from their history just lined up there. And you reminded of, how successful this team has been in the past. And that's obviously what they're trying to do, recapture those days. But in Formula 1, it's much easier to drop down to the bottom than it is to climb back up to the top. And so it's going to take some time to do it. But like you just said, Ed, they're making progress. And at the moment, that's the best you can ask for. Because if you look around them, the midfield teams, what other teams can say that? What other teams can say that they're making the kind of progress that McLaren are making at the moment? Not many.
Exactly, and it's going to be a question of how the car goes on track now. So let's see. The proof of the pudding, as I keep saying, is in the eating, which is testing. Doesn't really work as a metaphor, does it?
No, not so much. But I'm happy to talk about eating anytime.
I think of the two of us on this podcast, I'm the one who's got the better credentials as it comes to that. So for those who haven't seen us, I'm on the large side. I would say that's being generous to me, and Lawrence Barretto is. If he's facing side onto you, you might miss him.
Yeah, I'm on the very tiny side, I suppose, yeah.
But anyway, as you can probably tell from the fact that the ambient noise has been dropping and people are leaving, the event has sort of wound down, and I think we're probably getting some nasty looks saying we should probably move on. They've been wonderful hosts here at McLaren, but it's best not to outstay our welcome more than we already are. So thank you very much for Lawrence Barretto. You can read his work on F1.com, and we may hear from him and some other special guests in the future on this podcast.